the law in the 1965 Act, firstly, and then we move forward to the Freedom of Information Act. So it's like the government and public officials are holding the two faces. What will you say to this, Mr. Mohamed Boujalo Jamhuriya?
Thank you very much, Frido. I think we are coming back to where I started. It all boils down to perceptions, attitudes, etc., and everything has to do with human infrastructure. You see, we are having some mixing up here. Freedom of information, I use it every day. Does not say you have to go and ask how many wives this man has or how many that man has. It says the right to know what a government is doing. And by definition, before you can know what a government is doing, there is a legal process. In our way, we use a website in which everybody's personal data is there. You have a login code and everything, you can go in. If you want to know who is paying tax, who is not paying tax, you can get that information. But there are limits. What Max Jimmy was talking about just now is the right to investigate, which is different from the right to know. If politicians are corrupt, I think if we have very good investigative journalists, they can investigate them and expose them with or without a Freedom of Information Act. Whereas, on the other hand, if a company has signed a contract with the government of Sierra Leone, and people want to know what that contract entails, if we don't have a Freedom of Information Act, that can be used not to give the information. But when we have it, then, by law, the company or whoever is asked has to give that information if the procedures are met. You see, the whole thing as I see it, Mr. Sise, is that this lack of trust is still prevalent in our society. The society does not trust the politicians, because the politicians don't trust the society. It does not necessarily mean that the unwillingness or lack of will to pass those bills is because of corruption. It will be because of maybe wrong perceptions. Oh, if we pass this bill, then people will use them against it. And it does not only go with the politicians. We must be looking outside the political circle. What about the administration? Or what we call the civil service? That act will affect them also. So it's a very complex situation which we don't have to be looking at from a narrow tunnel view. And like from the point I started, the media has a role to play to make it clear to society that this and this and this and this will be the benefits of this act, such that even the politicians who may be reluctant to have this act passed will now think from a different perspective and have it passed. And I think what we are doing now, this radio program we are doing, if it gets down there, it's going to build another perspective of this whole thing. And it will be bringing about a change of attitudes and perceptions to what freedom of information is all about. Because the thing you see, our society, we must not forget, is a polarized society, politically and in every way. So whenever people come with things that should bring change and dynamic change, the first and the most obvious interpretation of it is political. Oh, if you allow this, they are going to use this for this. Even with this issue which people are advocating for, the diaspora voting, it has a lot of advantages for the society, but because of the polarization of the society, resulting from a poor human infrastructure, people see it differently. So my beginning was we have to have a media that will bring about the enhancement of human infrastructure, change the attitudes of the people, everything is changed. While people don't have problems with government, there's not a problem with people because the right attitude is in place. The human infrastructure is in place. You see, let us move away from making things petty, Mr. President. Let us look at the bigger picture. The future of our country is at the crossroads. We have had diamonds. It led us to something. Now we are talking about oil. So let us forget about party politics or whatever. Let us begin to look at the bigger picture and see what we can do to bring about that change that will hold the society together. Otherwise, we are wasting our time, honestly. And the media, like by definition you gave, not being only journalism or press or whatever, but including every aspect of information giving and accessing, has to be built such that it can bring about and enhance a human infrastructure that will see our nation go into the 22nd century as a nation, not as a failed state. That is my own submission, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Boyjalo Jambore. You talked about legal means of gaining access to information. We practiced journalism when the war was at its bitterest, isn't it, Boyjalo, Mr. Magujimi, and Umar Fofana? I don't know what more legality you need to gain access. You guys remember? Yeah? You remember? Yes. You remember? We practiced it, right? I don't know what more legality you need to gain. And I was practicing journalism. My first call into journalism was practicing it with a quasi-government newspaper, that is Liberty Voice, partly owned by the NPRC, the National Provisional Ruling Council, and partly owned by us, right? That's how we practice journalism. But even for us to gain access to information was something else, right? But not to dwell on that point too long. What Boyjalo Jambore said with regards to legal means of gaining access to information is what we are talking about. Freedom of Information Act. That's the legality. Empowering the journalists. You understand?
Absolutely.
Yeah. To gain. If I can read section 27 of Part 4, that is Part 5 of the the Public Order Act of 1965, it says, any person who maliciously publishes any defamatory matter shall be guilty of an offense called libel and liable on conviction to a fine not exceeding 700 leons. Okay, that was old days. I don't know how they interpret it now. Or for imprisonment for a period not exceeding 2 years.
2 years.
Or to both such fine and imprisonment. That's where the Freedom of Information Act comes in. To decriminalize the this libel law. At the end of the day, you are publishing this thing genuinely.
Again,
yes,
talking. So there's a caveat there, Saido.
Is that Umaru?
No, can I interject there, please?
Yeah, Umaru, I'm coming to you now. I'm coming to you, Umaru. I'm coming to you. You are a practicing journalist, presently in Sierra Leone, which is the beauty of this discussion, right? How do you go around the bureaucratic bottleneck? You or your sub-reporters, your reporters, etc., or sub-editors, how do you go around this bureaucratic bottleneck to gain access to news, information you really need? How do you do that? Plus what you want to say. Go on, please.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think things have generally improved since the war ended in 2002, in the sense that times there were when if somebody wanted to access information, just basic general information, they would have to struggle for such a piece of information for almost forever. Now, the government introduced the regular press conference, which I think dates back to 1998, when Jan Kaba's overthrown government was reinstated. And then they started the press conference at State House, and it has continued ever since, even if it has shifted now to the Ministry of Information. But what happens in these press conferences is the government gives you a piece of information that they want you to have, and not necessarily the information that you need to know. You understand? And which is where the difficulty comes in. But
without holding you up, Omaro, without holding you up, you remember the George Koreama incident of Daily Mail?
Absolutely. The George Koreama incident.
George Koreama incident. For publishing what really happened at the war front, there was facts.
What really happened? Which has to do with the Part 5 area of the Public Order Act that you spoke about. And quickly, let me talk about the issue of trust. And I think Dela Jamboree harped on the point quite precisely when he spoke about the lack of trust. And this is exactly why we need the FOI law. Because Sweden is the most trusting country in the world, because they were the first country in the 1600s that passed the Freedom of Information law. So generations have come over the centuries having access to information, and as a result, they are trusting. They believe in what their government people tell them. Ours is a society where we have the secrecy law. So we are, they're saying here that you want to play me politics, it means you want to tell me lies. Because the notion here is politics means lie telling, because ours is a secretive society. And I think the best way for us to emancipate ourselves from that is by having a freedom of information law, which makes nonsense of Chapter 3 of the country's constitution, which guarantees freedom of expression. How can you express yourself about something you are not informed about? Firstly, for you to be able to express the freedom of expression, you have to have access to the piece of information you want to express yourself about. So they are inextricably linked, which is why the issue of criminal and seditious libel can make nonsense if it continues to remain in our law books, even if we have an FOI law. The reason is, if you go further to read about that Part 5 in that Public Order Act, it tells you that the graver the libel, the graver the truth, the graver the libel. And truth is not a defense under the Public Order Act for the criminal and seditious libel law components. Which is why I feel that if we have the FOI law, and I feel that there is no political will, genuinely, and I can add to what I've said already to prove that point, the World Bank, and I've been involved with this for a very long time, the World Bank had to bring down their feet to force the government into having the FOI bill tabled in Parliament before it happened. Now, my suspicion is, when once the World Bank, the Irish Embassy, and all those guys were asking that this bill should be promulgated, then the Ministry of Information went to the Law Officers Department and treated a bill that civil society had drafted in collaboration with government. Then they tabled it to appease the World Bank and other guys that were making moves. And now the excuse the government gave later on was, well, we have separation of powers in Sierra Leone. We have sent our bill in Parliament. You can't blame it on us. Blame it on the MPs if it is not promulgated. That is complete balderdash. And this is the reason why I feel it is complete balderdash. There is what is called certificate of urgency. The president has the power to give certificate of urgency or emergency or whatever it's called to a bill that is tabled in Parliament. Why didn't the president at any time do that with the Freedom of Information Bill, when so many other bills that were not as important as the FOI bill that came after the FOI bill had been tabled in Parliament were given certificates of emergency, and they were duly promulgated, and they included the Petroleum Act. The Petroleum Act was such a very crucial thing that it ought not to have been forced through without a Freedom of Information law, which would have enabled the public to ask questions about this country's petroleum prospects. So the question is, why was that forced through? Why was the Minerals Act forced through? Why wasn't the FOI bill forced through if there was a political will in ensuring that it was promulgated? I think this whole thing is double-speak. They will tell us one thing here, and I'm not exonerating or vindicating any political party. Sierra Leone's parliament was not then dominated by only one party or made up of only one party. We had three political parties in parliament at the time: the SLPP, the APC, and the PMDC. And none of them convinced me that they were in support of promulgating the FOI bill, because none of them came publicly to distance themselves from the apparent deliberate dilly-dallying on passing the FOI law. So I blame it on all three parties in parliament at the time. Again, the APC had majority in